Let me just say thank you for coming to the first briefing of our carbon lunches. My name is Shannon Angelski, and I'm the Executive Director of the Carbon Utilization Research Council. I'm one of the organizations that's hosting this event alongside with the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute and the Carbon Capture Coalition. As I mentioned, we have the honor of Senator Joe Manchin being here to help us launch this program today. But before I introduce him, I just have a couple of housekeeping items. First, hopefully you all found the box lunches, and hopefully there's enough remaining. If you didn't get one, please do. We do have over 140 people registered, but so just looking for room, make sure you all squeeze to the middle if you don't mind for people that might file in. And then lastly, we are recording this event, so that way those that couldn't join us today will be able to see this on our host website after the event. So wanted to make sure that everybody was aware of that. So let me introduce Senator Manchin. Thank you again for coming today. As a Democrat from West Virginia, Senator Manchin is strongly committed to developing a balanced national energy plan that utilizes all of our resources and recognizes that fossil fuels will continue to be a vital part of our energy mix for decades. In his role as the ranking member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, he is committed to taking a balanced and common sense approach that considers the needs of both our environment and the demands of our economy, and that both can be addressed together if we're going to achieve energy independence. We are fortunate to have Senator Manchin as a champion in the Senate for advancing the carbon capture policy through several bills that he sponsored and co-sponsored. One in particular was a bill that he introduced last Congress, the Fossil Energy Utilization Enhancement and Leadership Act, which is called the FUEL Act in short. And this bill would actually prioritize carbon capture technology and accelerate it through enhanced fossil energy authorizations and a research and development program at the Department of Energy. He also co-sponsored the Future Act for reform and expansion of the Section 45Q carbon sequestration tax credits, as well as several bills introduced in this Congress, including the Use It Act and the Carbon Capture Modernization Act. Mouthful. So thank you, Senator, for your demonstrated leadership and for recognizing the need for carbon capture policy as part of your committee's efforts, and we look forward to working with you in this Congress. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Shannon gave most of the specifics, so I don't have to get into much detail here. Let me just say that, first of all, I'm pleased to be here and pleased that all of you are coming and have the interest in what needs to be done. But let me give you a little bit of a snapshot of what we're doing in the committee. I just left the committee now. So you have Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, Joe Manchin from West Virginia. Two states are heavy lifting, heavy producing. That basically makes their first and foremost foray into climate change. Climate change is real. And those who deny haven't been paying attention or don't want to accept the scientific facts. You have to know how to talk about climate change to states like mine. You go to a state like West Virginia and talk about climate change, they're going to be denying that basically, now wait a minute, climate has always changed. They'll go back to biblical times. We're going to have a cycle. But when you talk about the last century, there's no denouncing, no doubt that humans have made an absolutely most significant impact than ever in the history of climate and growth. We can talk in those terms. So once you get people understanding, we're looking at real facts right now, what's happening. So in doing that, you've got all different types of people talking from all different spectrums of the political paradigm, if you will, of what they want to do. The new bills are out there, people are talking about, it's elimination. Well, elimination won't work because it's not about North American climate, it's not about the U.S. climate, it's global climate. So you better look at innovation. Innovation is what's going to make the difference. If you talk to Dr. Karl from the IEA, he'll tell you, you can do whatever you want to do in North America. Might make a dent, not much of a dent in the climate. You better be looking at Asia. You better be looking at China. You better be looking at India. You better look at what's happening. We're using more energy now and demanding more energy around the world than ever before. Because there's people for the first time to electrify. This is into the developing world, if you will. So we have to face that. So we've been talking It's all economics. It's truly all numbers, dollars and cents in economics. The average coal-fired plant in America is around 40 years of age. They're starting to time out. So it's easier for people to make decisions. So whatever the economics is of the day and the future of the economics might give them a source of energy, they're going to go to the cheapest route. Just common sense. So natural gas is in abundance. We have an ocean of energy underneath us in West Virginia with gas. And gas combines are much cheaper than rebuilding or building a brand new coal-fired plant. People in West Virginia, we have to understand that. We've been very blessed also with some of the best metallurgical coal in the world. So our metallurgical demand is still high. And basically, coal consumption in plants in America, North America, up to 2040 by the EIA's estimation, will still be about 20 to 23, maybe 25. But in the 20 to 25% range of what we develop or deliver as far as energy to the United States. Gas will continue to rise, and nuclear. So if you talk to Dr. Grill, he says if you want to decarbonize, then you better find a way to make sure you're able to use carbon capture utilization. It has to happen around the world. And also nuclear. That's the easiest, quickest, fastest way to decarbonize. So I've always said, I'm not for elimination, I'm for innovation. Where do we go from here? Last 10 or so years, we haven't done a whole lot. Very little R&D has been spent. John knows what we're talking about here at WVU, what we're dealing with every day. We need a moonshot. We sure do need a moonshot. We need to figure out what can we do with carbon capture utilization and do it in a way that is economically, it's feasible, and it's reasonable. Give you an example. We have Mountaineer Plant in West Virginia. I was governor of the state of West Virginia. The Mountaineer Plant did a carbon capture experiment, basically, showing that we could take clear stream carbon off in a commercial way. We proved we could do it. But guess what? When President Obama says, go ahead and build a coal plant and we'll break you, he knew exactly the cost. We had a 900 megawatt plant. We were going to utilize about 30% of that plant's capacity, basically, to capture and to store it. You can't build a plant on cost of 900 megawatts and try to pay it off on 600 megawatts of production. It just doesn't work. So we've got to find a way. That's the moonshot. How do we entice? What do we do? The R&D money that we should be spending. So I've talked to Rick Perry. We're doing everything we can to basically increase that. But I want to have a carrot out there. Somehow I want to have a carrot. There's got to be a research institution. There's got to be a higher educational institution that's going to be able to find out in a simplistic way, can this carbon, can we basically retrofit the plants that we have and give extra life to them? But basically, what do we do with China and India? But our plants, I said, was average of 40 years of age. The Asian plants, an average of 11 years. Now, if you finance a plant, you're financing it when you finance a house 30 years or so. We're going to finance some plants 40 to 50 years. You think they're going to pull them off lines 30 years sooner? They're not. So if the people who want to go a different direction, thinking, well, that's in a perfect world, it's a dream world, that would be wonderful. But it's not the real world. My job as being ranking member on energy and natural resources to make sure we have affordable, dependable, reliable power 24/7. Base load, basically energizing the grid system, how this thing works. That's my job. The other thing I can do with my voice is how do we change our policies as far as our trading policies and the tariffs that we charge on the countries that we know are polluting without even making any effort whatsoever, or basically having a facade of what they're trying to do to make you believe they're doing something and not really doing it. That we could say, here, you want caveats to our markets? This is the tariffs, basically the trading policies we have. This is what you have to do. We have to develop that. This is where it's going to happen. It'll happen right here in the United States of America. No one's going to step up to take our place in any of these arenas. They might give you a good song and dance. They're not stepping up to do it. So it's up to us to do it. Are we willing to do it? Can we step ahead of this? So we're trying to put a common sense approach to a real problem. And climate change is real. And we have to address that in the most pragmatic way. And that's what we're trying to do. And that's what Lisa and I are committed to getting done. So we've had climate hearings. We're going to have more. What we're trying to do is get the facts out. I don't need to tell you all. You're all around this Capitol. You see what's going on. You can talk to any group of people, any industrial group, or you can talk to any political group. It's like playing darts and no one can agree where the bullseye is. Think about that. We're going to play a game of darts here, but we're not sure. Bullseye might be on this side or this side. And that's what we're dealing with. It's unbelievable today. We can't even get to a set of facts that we can start trying to solve a problem off of a baseline. And that is hard. It's hard. So what we're trying to do, 2 states, heavy lifting, that affect us immensely, but we're willing to. I've said this, if there was an energy out here that's dependable, reliable, and affordable 24/7, base load, no emissions, count me in. I'm there. If not, how can I make what I produce for this country and what we've done for this country, make it more environmentally friendly? I think that's the balance we look for. That's the pragmatic approach, and I think most people understand that. But you have to be able to talk in real terms. What have we done? What can be done? What are we going to do? And I'm having great conversations with Secretary Kerry. He's been a good friend. We work very well together. I think an awful lot of money we put in R&D. Q45 is going to be great. We need people to step up. We need to basically give a little bit more time on that. I think that's all have to be under. You have to be underway and under construction by what, 2021? 2024. We're going to try to extend that to where you have to have your plans completed and things of that sort. It might not be in construction, but we're going down that path because I think this is a real game changer. Create more people in utilizing that. Also, the amount of money that we can put to R&D right now. We have metals, we have basically collaboration, public-private partnership type things, but I'm still looking for one even bigger carrot than that. There's going to be a prize, like a lottery prize. You hit it, baby, this is yours. And I got I'm still working on that one. I haven't figured it all out yet. But I think I'm just envying the guy that won $750 million last night. But we're trying to figure out who he is. Maybe he's a real changer here. I'll get involved in the game. I can only tell you, I'm excited about where we are right now. I'm excited about the committee that I'm serving on with Lisa Murkowski. I'm excited about basically putting common sense and putting a pragmatic approach to fixing, I think, one of the greatest challenges we have and the world faces. But I do understand it's a global climate, it's not just our climate. I do understand that we set the standard and we will set the trend of what we do if it's going to be done. And for India, I've said this, if you've ever been to India and if you've ever been to rural India, the order of the day for most females and their children is to go around and collect animal waste and to put that into pies, if you will, and let it bake in the sun, hot sun, to where they can use it for fuel at night to cook their food and keep their home. Now, if you're giving them electricity for the first time, I guarantee they don't care what's coming out of the smokestack. They don't care how you're burning it, they don't care how you produce it. Just give me something, I don't have to do that anymore. So when you think about and so I said this, in the 1930s, a lot of rural America didn't have electricity. FDR comes along with electrification. It wasn't economically feasible to basically say, we're going to go up this hall, I've got 5 homes up here, we have 2 homes over here, but everyone deserves that opportunity to be electrified. But we did it. And we're the leader of the world. And I think other countries have the same desires that we had 100 years ago. Why shouldn't we? And why can't we help them do it better and cleaner than we ever did it before? I think that's the role. That's the lead the U.S. plays. And I think that all of us working together. But having people to deny, it's hard. You know, I have people that deny that basically opiate addiction is an illness and not a crime. They still believe it's a crime. I believed that in 1980. I don't believe it anymore. Addiction is basically an illness. Illness needs treatment. And if you can prevent someone from being addicted, that's the best treatment of all. But once they get addicted, you have to treat it. This is no different. We're dealing with the same type of facts today. Your thought process might have changed. Your opinions might have changed over the years. But I've always said this, if you can't change your mind, you can't change anything. And in this place here, it's hard. Common sense is not common in Washington. I have found that out in 8 years. It doesn't really ring true through all the hallways here. But I still believe there's good in everybody's heart that comes here for the right reason. We just got to make sure we allow them to do the right things. So with that, I say thank you. God bless you. Keep doing what you're doing. We need you. Any questions? I'm happy to take any questions. You got a free shot here, today. Anybody? Quiet, nice. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you could comment briefly on Senator Alexander's position from a couple of days ago. He also talked about harnessing the national labs and moonshot of innovation.
Well, I didn't see the comment that he made, or I didn't see the statement that came out. But if he's talking about with all of our national, yeah. The only thing, I always like a public-private, and I'll tell you the reason I do. I've been involved in the public sector. I've always been a private citizen. I've been a private business person. The public sector doesn't have timetables. You can put a timetable on it, but it doesn't really mean anything. Because no one's going to fire and throw them out, so we did meet this deadline. Our shareholders and our investments and return on investment, all that, okay? They don't have that. You put the private sector into it, and they put the push on. That's what I'm saying. I'm trying to get private and public working. The public has basically the basis to work off of. They have the labs. They have everything ready to go. You bring the private sector into it and put the push behind it, we'll make something happen. We can't sit around and wait for another 5 or 10 years. You know, in my mind, knowing how smart all of you all are, give you an example. In the 1980s, in West Virginia, we were doing the Clean Air Act. Okay. In trying to find a pathway forward to take particulates out, we said, this is the umbrella you work under, this is what the fees you pay, and these fees will be used to correct the problem. Everybody talks about fees, carbon fees, cap and trade, this and that, but no one wants to fix the problem. They just want to shuffle the deck, and it's a financial deal and reward. I said, wait a minute. If you want to fix the carbon problem, then by God, you better use the money to give an incentive to do that. So with that, we had scrubbers. Well, in West Virginia, a lot of our plants, depending on what part of the state they were in, were using high sulfur, low sulfur, medium sulfur, whatever was available close to it. It made all the sense in the world. And a lot of the coal-fired plants that we have all around the world, net export of energy, came from areas that basically they took advantage of the coal supplies. When this all came into effect, we lost all of our northern coal fields because they were higher sulfur, 2, 3, 4%. They all went down and switched fuels until the technology came on board. They switched fuels to lower sulfur. They put a heck of a bind on the coal fields up north. Then basically scrubbers come on. When the scrubbers came on, then basically that coal came back to a certain extent. They could use it. But what happened with the scrubbers? We had a tremendous amount of limestone. And then with the limestone injection, basically our waste was high in alkalinity. We start backfilling all of our mining that we had basic leakage from it or drainage from it, and start backfilling it with the high alkalinity that started cleaning up our water system. Then on top of that, we found out, wait a minute, we can even make gypsum board out of some of this because the high alkalinity was so great. So we have a gypsum board factory set beside a coal-fired plant. I'm thinking, golly, you people are so smart, can't you figure a way to solidify this CO2 that we can use it for a waste fuel? Come on, somebody can do that. But that's what there has to be. I know the cost of pressurizing 1800 psi and trying to stick that stuff in the ground. And if you don't have enhanced oil or enhanced gas or enhanced value coming back out, you're dead. You're dead financially. This doesn't work. And we can't force other countries to use something that's a financial loser. It won't happen. These are developing nations. These are not mature nations. They're still developing, trying to get where we have been for quite some time. So you can't expect them to take a financial hit like that. But if we can show the technologies there, this is what you do, and this is the extra value for the waste stream, something like that's got to happen. And there's someone out there going to hit it. And when they do, we ought to pay them handsomely for doing it as quickly as possible. Anybody else? Yes.
Just a quick one. You mentioned talking to Secretary Kerry and Department of Energy, and you have an NPL lab in your state.
Right.
I'm wondering, in your conversations with him, are you helping to get across the point that DOE is much more than a basic science institution? And getting to your point, it needs to actually commercialize those technologies. Otherwise, sort of what's the point of spending taxpayer dollars if having them sit on a shelf?
Yeah. In defense of NETL, nettle. The nettle in Morgantown was the ones with private sector developed fracking. That's where the fracking started. That's how they were able to prove that fracking was possible. Horizontal drilling was possible, and it all could work. There's a lot more that can be done, but without the private sector push, we don't seem to get there as quick as we should. And he will share. I assure you that technology will be shared. But I like to have it developed in the private sector, hand in hand. WVU is very much in WVU is connected with the metal. We're attracting private investors to come in, work with us to accelerate our process, if you will. Anybody else? Let me just say thank you again. This is truly, this is a game changer. You know, we just had we have the new Green Deal. If you want to give any type of credit for what they have done, it's elevated the conversation across all spectrums. It's a wonderful aspiration to say you're going to do this. And they kind of threw a couple extra things in there they didn't have to with all the social changes they wanted to make. That will be done in different policies. But from an energy standpoint, we want to get to a less carbon environment. They want carbon free. That may happen in your children or grandchildren's, you know, it might be commercial hydro, it might be something. But to understand the grid, they've got to have dependable, reliable, base load power. You can't energize this grid without it. It can't come on. So I talked to a group, of high schools, and they said, well, this would be wonderful. I said, it is. I said, the only thing I want you to do, tell me what 5 hours a day you want your energy. If you can just tell me when you want to wash your clothes, when you want to keep your food from swelling, when you want to heat your house, when you want to cook, just tell me the 5 hours you'd like to have that happen. Because that's all I can give you right now. I want to give you more, but that's all if you want to go that route. If you want to work with me, I can give it to you 24/7, the way you've always had it, and do it in a much cleaner and better environment if you work with me. And that's all I'm asking. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. If there's any duo in Congress, I think that Senator Manchin and Chairman Murkowski to get the innovation agenda moved forward. So we're looking forward to working with that committee. What I wanted to do is just introduce this briefing series very quickly, so that way we can try to stay on time here. And while Congressman Marquisi, you may have seen from some of our notifications that were sent out that he was scheduled to speak today, and unfortunately had a personal matter that he had to return to his state yesterday. So although he's absent, we just want to acknowledge the congressman and all of his work and leadership on carbon capture in the House. I would say, as somebody who early in his tenure took up the mantle for the carbon capture policy, I think that that's been an extraordinarily helpful effort in the House, and he is currently the sponsor of the Use It Act, co-sponsor, of course, in the last Congress, the 45Q legislation, and also led through the House Science Committee, through his position of membership on the House Science Committee, the Fossil Energy Research and Development Act, which would have prioritized and accelerated carbon capture as well. So I just wanted to recognize him, despite the fact that he wasn't able to be here today. I also just want to recognize Senator Shelley Moore Capito, who actually reserved this room for us, another true champion from West Virginia in support of these policies in Congress. She has sponsored and co-sponsored all of the legislation that we've already named, but she plays an important role over here in the bipartisan teaming that we've seen to advance carbon capture policy. I just want to briefly, by background, introduce the Carbon Utilization Research Council, and also will allow our hosts to introduce their organizations as well. But for those of you that are not familiar with CURC, as we call ourselves, we're an organization, mainly industry, but academia, state organizations, that are focused on technology solutions for the responsible use of our nation's fossil fuel resources. We serve as an industry voice and advocate by identifying policy pathways in support of those technologies that will enable us to benefit from the use of fossil fuels while also accomplishing all of our environmental objectives. As I mentioned, the Global CCS Institute, as well as the Carbon Capture Coalition, are also our hosts. We came together earlier this year, and with this Congress, we decided we wanted to develop this program to try to help raise awareness about what we mean by carbon capture. What is it? What is its role in all of the above energy policy, as well as a part of the climate solution set? And quite frankly, to dispel any myths that may exist about the fact that carbon capture, to some, they're skeptical. It's not a real solution. We hope to change people's minds on that through this briefing series. So I also want to acknowledge and recognize our supporters, the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, the Clean Air Task Force, ClearPath, Third Way, the Bipartisan Policy Center, and the Great Plains Institute. They're all part of this effort, I would say, collectively, and contribute to the communication and the messaging around the need for carbon capture. Lastly, I just want to acknowledge that passage of the future the Section 45Q carbon sequestration tax credit really put carbon capture on everyone's radar screen last year, and in the process leading up to passage of future. It's a real game changer. Several carbon capture projects are in development as a result of this policy directly. We're seeing Wall Street get invigorated and creating new tools to help finance projects as a result of this. It's really stimulated a lot of development, and it's really in a very exciting time for us here in the U.S. We're really eagerly awaiting Treasury guidance. I'm sure many of you have heard about that, so we all know and understand what the rules will be for 45Q, so we can actually start building projects. And at the same time, what you're probably going to hear from us over the course of these 5 briefings is that in addition to 45Q, and that will help catalyze this industry in this country, there's still some other policy opportunities that will remain to help us further catalyze and deploy carbon capture in this country. So again, our goal is to help you develop an understanding of how all of the pieces of the CCUS equation fit together, and how carbon capture will help us to not only meet our global climate goals, but then also grow our economy and improve our environment. So I want to ask Brad Crabtree if he could come up to introduce the Carbon Capture Coalition, and Jeff Erikson, who's on our agenda to speak later, will also have an opportunity to talk about Global CCS Institute.
Thank you, Shannon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. I also want to thank the rest of your team, Shannon and Lee Beck. Lee is here from the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute. A lot of hard work has already gone into this briefing and subsequent ones. Also, the partnership between the Carbon Capture Coalition and CURC has been a great one. We worked for several years together to advance the 45Q legislation, and it was a great success. And look forward to working with you and others in the room on an even more ambitious policy agenda going forward. Very briefly, the Carbon Capture Coalition is an alliance of 60 energy, industrial, manufacturing technology companies, labor unions, environmental, clean energy, and agricultural organizations, all working together, all focused on a common goal of accelerating the deployment of carbon capture technology across our entire economy. I'll emphasize that these are folks that often don't work together in Washington, and they found common cause over nearly a decade now, and that's because of the extraordinary benefits of carbon capture. Carbon capture's essential importance in meeting mid-century climate goals for our country and globally, for ensuring domestic energy independence, and also safeguarding our domestic energy, industrial, and manufacturing jobs base, some of the highest paying jobs in the country. That's also why carbon capture enjoys such broad bipartisan support and growing momentum right now here on Capitol Hill. Shannon has mentioned the Future Act, so did Senator Manchin. Support for the Future Act spanned the entire spectrum of Congress politically. There were 25 senators co-sponsoring, 50 members of the House, from the very most conservative members to the most liberal members from every region of the country. And this Congress already, there's been several bipartisan bills already introduced that you'll hear more about over the course of these briefings. And so I just want to thank you for all being here, and I hope these briefings will inspire all of you and all of us to work together to continue to make the kind of progress we've already made with 45Q. And so with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Bob Perciasepe. Bob is former, many of you in the room know Bob, former Deputy Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency in the Obama administration. Before that, he served as Secretary of the Environment in the state of Maryland. I also want to emphasize that Bob is a partner in this work. The Carbon Capture Coalition is co-staffed by the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions and the Great Plains Institute, the organization I work for. And Bob, you've been a great partner in that. Thank you. And with no further ado, Bob Perciasepe.
Thanks, Brad, and Shannon, thank you guys for the work that you're doing on this, and I want to shout out, obviously, Senator Manchin for all the work and leadership that he provides. It does take a little bit of leadership by the elected officials, for all of us who toil in the technical side of it and try to continue to provide information and ideas. It does take people to run with the ball up here on the Hill, and I think during the course of these briefings we'll hear more and more about that. But the interesting part that Brad mentioned already is the ball running, I'll call it, is being done in a bipartisan way. And this is a very important muscle of the United States Congress that just needs a little more exercise. And I think that that the work we're doing on the Carbon Capture Coalition and with all our partners on that is providing the gymnasium for the members of Congress to exercise that muscle. Well, I never used that one before, it just came to me. So I'm going to use it again. Look, just very briefly, the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, one of the sponsors today, we're an independent, non-partisan, non-profit organization that works to forge climate solutions, as our name says, and we work with businesses and cities and states, and even on the international level. And I'll get to that in a minute here, as the Senator brought up the international implications of some of the work that's going on here. The coalition that Brad mentioned, the Carbon Capture Coalition, I think is a good example of how when people sit down and think and talk and figure out what needs to get done, that you can build that kind of broad coalition. I'm not going to repeat, Brad, everything you've already said, which I could, because it's inspirational. For those of us who work on this issue, sometimes we always feel like if you're A, then you cannot be B, or if you're B, you cannot be A. Or as I often say, this is not a binary choice. You don't turn the switch on and off. These things are complicated, and you got to bring people together. And some of the work that's going on now is starting to do that. I really agree with Senator Manchin when he says what's been happening, where there are a lot of groups talking about carbon taxes, clean energy standards, the Green New Deal. All of this has begun to elevate the discussion in the United States Congress, perhaps more so than in almost a decade. And I think this is good. And we need to keep talking about all these different options and all these different ideas, and there will be hearings on them. But one of the things that's important to not lose track of is that there are no regrets, really important things that can be happening now, even while that debate goes on, which I think will go on for a couple of Congresses. But that doesn't mean we should just wait for that to happen. And that's part of what some of this work is. That's part of what 45Q was in the last Congress. There's no need to wait for getting things going that we know are going to be needed. You know, one of the issues we often have in the climate change arena that I spend a lot of time working on is when you talk to people, to me sometimes it's not so much whether they agree or disagree with the science, or is the climate really changing? Well, of course, plate tectonics, you know, it's going to change. But it's often really as simple as I don't see my future in the solutions that people are talking about. And if you can't see your future in the solutions people are talking about, you have an aversion to dealing with the issue. I mean, this is human nature. And so the idea really on many of these projects, and particularly in carbon capture and storage, is to start to get a wider group of people globally, and especially in the United States, to be able to see their own future and their own potential in the solutions we're talking about. You know, there is exaggeration that we won't be able to fly airplanes. Of course we will. But the idea that we have to get better at seeing how the solutions benefit everybody is a really important thing. And the Senator touched on many of these things. And, you know, one of the other issues that brings C2ES, that's the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, shortened, I now can say it rolls off my tongue, C2ES. One of the reasons we're so interested in this is multifold. One is that there are going to be industrial and electric generating facilities on Earth in 2050 making electricity with fossil fuels. This is going to be true. I've time traveled out there, I can tell you. No, I'm kidding. I wouldn't be here if I figured that out. But the truth is, the transition, the senator touched on this, some of the facilities that are being built now in Asia and Eastern Europe and other places are still going to be in the prime of their life, later in this half a century. And so we need to be able to be planning to deal with those emissions. To not plan to deal with those emissions is like putting your head in the sand. It's like saying, I want to take the risk that somehow they won't be here. And from a person who works on climate change, if we're running an organization that works on climate change, that's a risk that's too high to take. And this is an important factor on why you'll see more and more environmental organizations, and Brad touched on this with the 60 members we have in the coalition, are really starting to look harder at these kinds of technologies and the need to get the innovation going on these technologies. Let me raise another issue. There are going to be sources of carbon and greenhouse gas emissions that have nothing to do with burning fossil fuels. They're part of industrial processes. If you use fermentation in your industrial process, if you do other kinds of chemical reactions in your big industrial processes to make many of the products that we use every day, by virtue of those processes, greenhouse gases are produced. And even if they were running on 100% renewable energy or nuclear energy, they're still going to be making greenhouse gases. And so we have to figure out what to do with those. When we make hydrogen in the United States, there's a couple of different ways to make hydrogen. Actually, there's probably a lot of different ways to make hydrogen. But the two that most people talk about is hydrolysis, when you stick electricity into water. And I can't remember, the people here will know this. Cathode and the anode, which one gets the oxygen and which one gets the hydrogen. But that takes a lot of energy, but it produces those gases. The other way in which most of the hydrogen that is made in the United States is made is by what's called reforming methane. You take a process and you make the hydrogen. Methane is carbon and hydrogen, and you break the hydrogen off of that and you have the hydrogen, but it does make carbon oxides. And so if we want to use a lot of methane, let's say for fuel cells for houses, or fuel cells for cars, or fuel cells for industry, or for fuel cells to use for heat, for some of the industrial processes I was just talking about, we're going to need to make a lot of hydrogen, and we're going to need to be able to capture the carbon probably from some of those hydrogen manufacturing processes. So there are many reasons why we need to be looking at carbon capture. I'm not going to reiterate, but I'll just mention that exporting this technology around the world is going to be a pretty important piece of that, because, as I said, the United States and the rest of the world will have some fossil fuel electricity being made in the future. And then, as well as those other reasons I just mentioned. The urgency for action, I think with very, very few exceptions, and there are a few, but very few exceptions, most members of the United States Congress now will say just what Senator Manchin said here. This is a problem, and we have to deal with it. And so now the fun begins, really, if you're into legislative processes, how do we get this to go? But the urgency has become more and more apparent. That more science, the international program on carbon capture, the IPCC, which is the global group of scientists who look at this, and they look at the 1.5 degrees. I think we're going to hear a little bit more about this, right, Karl, from you. The National Climate Assessment by the United States government last year. All of these things are showing that the urgency and the need to act as quickly as possible, that there's only so much carbon and greenhouse gases we can put in the air before we start to exceed the level. Now, here's an interesting statistic. In February, it's actually a fact. In February of this year, the average global carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere was 411 parts per million. When I was born, it was around 300 parts per million. That's partly telling you how old I am, but also showing that in my lifetime, how much we've increased the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And there aren't a lot of volcanoes going off and all these other things people talk about. It's mostly the industrialization and the upgrading of everybody's quality of life that is causing this to happen. So how do we, Senator mentioned, how do we make this solution work together? So I think these are some of the issues that confront us. This is the rationale and the reason why we need to be investing in this technology. But I want to say, from the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions perspective, that this is not the only technology. This is what we're going to be focused on in these luncheon series, and it's vitally important. We can't get there without it and stay there. But we also need to be pushing other technologies like nuclear power, advanced nuclear, advanced renewable technologies like battery storage. All of these things are going to be needed. It's not a binary choice. If we're going to have more nuclear, that means we're not going to do carbon capture. If we do carbon capture, we're not going to have renewable energy. None of those statements I just made is true. We need all of those things together, and it's vital that we find the way to get the leadership in the United States Congress and the United States in general to bring that innovation for all of those technologies across the board to bear for the world. So I'm going to stop there with that high-level introduction. I know that we need to keep going here, and I really thank you guys for coming today, and I hope you come to all of these luncheons and learn more about all of the carbon capture and storage work.
Thanks, Bob. We are now going to turn it over to the Global CCS Institute. Jeff Erikson is going to tell us what do we mean by carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So for those of you that may still not quite get that formula yet, hopefully Jeff's going to help us out here. But Jeff joined the Institute in 2016 as General Manager of America, and also serves as General Manager for Client Engagement. And I'm going to let you introduce the organization. So.
On behalf of the Global CCS Institute, I also just want to say how pleased we are to be co-sponsor in this event this afternoon with the Carbon Utilization Research Council and the Carbon Capture Coalition. Just a word about the Global CCS Institute. We're a member-based organization. We're global in nature. Our mission is to accelerate the deployment of carbon capture globally. We have about 60 members around the world. About 50 staff that are located around the world. There's 4 of us that are based here in Washington, D.C. Each year we produce a flagship report called the Global Status of CCS. Typically comes out during the COP meetings in December. And after this event, we'll be sending all of you participating here today a link so you can have access to it. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge a couple of other CCS experts in the room. Peter Sunset is with us here today from GasNova. GasNova is an organization based outside of Oslo, Norway, that focuses on accelerating deployment of CCS in Norway. Dr. Julio Friedman is also here with us. Julio is a senior research scholar from the university and the CEO of the Carbon Record. So while they're not speaking today, I'm sure they'll be happy to answer any questions you might have afterwards. I've been tasked with giving you a high-level review of what carbon capture, utilization, and storage is, and you may wonder whether that's really necessary. Well, I'll say that earlier this year, in fact, we're about to release the results. We completed a survey of policymakers and influencers here on the Hill to gauge level of awareness and understanding of carbon capture. And when asked if they knew what CCS means in the context of energy, climate, and environment, less than half knew what CCS represented. So there's absolutely an information or knowledge gap here on the Hill. Many misperceptions and a lack of understanding as well about cost, safety, and viability. So this is a bit of an introduction to get us all on the same page. It might be a bit elementary for some of you. If it is, just bear with us. Carbon capture and storage, also known as CCS, CCUS, simply carbon capture, and many other monikers, refers to an integrated suite of technologies that can be deployed to prevent large quantities of CO2 generated by industrial and power facilities from being released into the atmosphere. There's 3 main components: capture, transportation, and storage. Let's talk for a minute about capture. A CO2 capture system is typically deployed at the facility. It's the source of the CO2 emissions. and its purpose is to separate the CO2 from the rest of the industrial exhaust stream. Technologies vary, but generally the approach taken is to first trap the CO2, then separate it out of the exhaust stream, and then collect that pure CO2 for transportation. I like to think of the air filter on the furnace at my house. But instead of trapping dust and dirt, we're trapping the CO2. And instead of throwing the air filter out with the trash, you're essentially knocking off the CO2 that's trapped there to separate it and collect it in pure form. So once you have it in pure form, and you remove the impurities and the water vapor, you compress it to a quasi-liquid phase called supercritical phase, and then put it into a pipeline or a ship or a truck or a combination of those, transport it to the storage site. Now in the US, there are about 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines carrying CO2, mostly in oil-producing regions. But there's much more a need for many more miles and many more pipelines to continue to build out that network. So on to storage. To store CO2, you need to inject it deep below the subsurface, typically more than a kilometer, often more than a mile or a couple of kilometers, into a porous rock formation with a cap rock on top, as you can see on the diagram on the right. It's similar to formations where oil or natural gas is often found. We generally classify storage as either storage associated with enhanced oil recovery or dedicated geological storage. Enhanced oil recovery, or EOR, very simply is using CO2 to improve or enhance the ability to produce oil. CO2 is injected into an oil field to mobilize the oil in the rock, allowing it to flow more easily to an oil production line. Oil companies are willing to pay for that, and so for that reason, that's why most of the carbon capture projects in the U.S. are associated with enhanced oil recovery. The best example of dedicated storage is the Sleipner facility offshore Norway. That's been operating and storing CO2 for more than 20 years now. A steep carbon tax was imposed on offshore oil production, and that made it more cost-effective to permanently store the CO2 than to emit it to the atmosphere. There are also dedicated storage projects at the Quest facility in Alberta, Canada, been operating for about 4 years now, and the Gorgon facility in Western Australia, which is expected to be operating. So I'm talking as if this is not some future technology, but one that's been in place for decades, and indeed that is the case. There are currently 18 large-scale, industrial-scale facilities in operation around the world, including 10 here in the U.S. And there are many more smaller-scale facilities. There's 5 more in construction and about 20 that are currently in development. These 18 operating facilities have cumulatively stored more than 230 million tons of CO2 and are currently capturing and storing about 33 million tons per year. So 33 million tons per year, is that a lot? Well, yes and no. As a point of reference, the Ivampa solar facility, the largest solar farm in the world located in California, was designed to reduce CO2 emissions by about 400,000 tons per year. So this is nearly 100 Ivanpah facilities. However, the IEA says that in order for CCS to contribute its fair share to global carbon reductions, we'll need to capture and store about 100 times what we capture today by mid-century. That's nearly 4 billion tons of CO2 on an annual basis. We often hear about carbon capture in the context of coal-fired power and to a lesser degree natural gas-fired power, but the hidden story is in industrial applications. Gas processing, hydrogen production, fertilizer manufacturing, ethanol production, steel, and cement making. Industrial emissions represent about 25% of total CO2 emissions worldwide. In fact, 16 out of those 18 operating facilities are on industrial facilities, and there's just 2 currently on power plants. Carbon capture remains the only technology that can deliver deep emissions reductions in those hard-to-abate industrial sectors. As mentioned earlier, decarbonizing these sectors is not simply about electrifying them with zero-carbon power. Cement plants create CO2 as part of the chemical process. Steel plants and others require high heat input. So it's not possible to merely replace fossil fuel. For many industrial applications, the physics and consequently the economics are better than they are in the power sector. Many industrial facilities already separate the CO2 as part of their industrial process, so there's nearly 100% pure CO2 stream. Ethanol production plants are a really good example of that. Just a word about carbon utilization. There's a lot of interest currently in carbon utilization that's using CO2 and making it useful products. Examples of current applications of carbon utilization include cement, aggregates, fuels, and plastics, and that's fantastic. I think all of us would like to see any material repurposed into useful products rather than treating it as a waste. But the problem is that we're generating way more CO2 than we can currently reuse. We see utilization as complementary to subsurface storage. And while the market opportunity is significant, utilization is certainly a way to gain support for investment in carbon capture. The scale, in terms of volume of CO2 sequestered, is limited, and scale is what we need now. So carbon utilization is not a substitute for carbon capture and geologic storage, but rather a complement to it. So, why aren't there more carbon capture facilities in operation? On a macro basis, it's a very cost-effective way to keep emissions below 2 degrees C. On a project basis, economics are challenged. And that's because CO2 or CO2 abatement is currently undervalued in the market. Policy confidence is necessary to encourage investment. Carbon capture and storage has the opportunity to be a backbone of a new carbon economy, sustaining and creating jobs, spurring technology innovation. It can help the U.S. lead the transition to a low-carbon economy. But business can't do it on its own. It does require the active hand of government to bring it to scale. I'm sure you'll be hearing more about this in addition to parliamentary. So with that, I'll take a pause. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Jeff. Let me introduce Karl Hausker of World Resources Institute. He is a senior fellow in WRI's climate program, where he leads analysis and modeling of climate mitigation. He has over 3 decades of work in this space and is no stranger to Capitol Hill, government, and so he's got a long history in this regard. He's led climate policy analysis and modeling projects also for USAID, the US EPA, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the Western Climate Initiative, and the California Air Resources Board. So he is a known quantity in this space, and we're really thrilled to have him here today to provide an overview of how carbon capture actually fits within a broader greenhouse gas emissions reduction strategy. So thank you, Karl.
On. Yes? Okay. I'm going to go really fast because we're running behind schedule, and Lee has also told me that the PowerPoints presented today are going to be posted. I have links at the bottom of mine, so bear with me as we zoom through this. What I'm going to do is do sort of a little bit of a deep dive on the IPCC 1.5 degrees report and bring out the implications for CCS. It's important to go into some detail because IPCC reports are a little bit opaque and require some digging. But the message is that CCS has an important role to play in nearly all the pathways that the IPCC lays out to try to keep warming to 1.5 degrees. Of course, the IPCC also looked at pathways to 2 degrees, looked at the differences and impacts between those, and we know that we need to keep warming to either 2 or 1.5 to avoid very dangerous impacts. The challenge is a little bit daunting for those. I'm sure some of you have seen the IPCC report where we start out in the range of over 40 gigatons of net CO2 emissions. Currently, we need to get on a steep decline to net zero emissions by 2050. Beyond that, we will probably require, most likely require, pathways with negative emissions. What happened to my clicker? So the IPCC laid out sort of 4 illustrative pathways, P1, P2, P3, P4, among the dozens and dozens of modeling exercises that they reviewed and synthesized for us. So, what do these 4 illustrative pathways look like? Again, in each case, pointer's driving me crazy. But it's always good to have a backup. So, P1, P2, P3, P4. Each of them have a very steep slope of emission reductions for CO2. All of them require carbon dioxide removal. In the case of P1, the modeling indicated that you could do that entirely through AFFLU, agricultural, forest, and other land use change, increasing the sequestration of CO2 in forests, plants, and soils. But in P2, P3, P4, there was foreseen the need for carbon dioxide removal through other means. The models used bioenergy with CCS, or BECCS. However, that could also be done with direct air capture or some of the more exotic techniques like rock weathering that could also succeed in removing CO2 from the atmosphere. The important thing I want to zoom in on here is to look at what's behind P1, P2, P3, P4, and the relative degrees of carbon dioxide removal needed, because CCS is likely going to be very important for that carbon dioxide removal, among the other things that Jeff and Bob talked about: industrial mitigation, emissions, power sector emissions. So, don't ask me why IPCC moved P1 over here from, so we have this sequence, they did that now. The key thing, this is a very interesting chart on where the IPCC sees our primary energy sources coming from. And one of the most notable things about this is that they project renewable energy is going to grow exponentially. But there are also important roles for CCS and nuclear to play. Again, consistent with what my 2 colleagues said earlier, we cannot throw any zero carbon technology overboard at this point. But the thing I really want to draw your attention to in the IPCC 4 illustrative pathways is how they draw this dotted line across here at 600 exajoules of global primary energy use currently. P1 and P2 lay forth some assumptions that could lead to a approximately 1/3 reduction between now and 2050 of primary energy demand through technology change, energy efficiency, electrification, but also social, cultural, behavioral changes. So P1 and P2 would drop total primary energy use from about 600 exajoules to 400 exajoules. Personal opinion, that might happen, but I think that is highly unlikely. It's probably more likely that we're going to be on, if we succeed in solving this problem, that we're going to be more in the P3, P4 range, where we do see either stabilization or some incremental growth in the 2030, 2050, 2100 period of time. So again, that's my opinion on the IPCC P4. I want to make sure and distinguish that. So, what role does CCS play in these IPCC scenarios? Here I've taken the IPCC chart on cumulative CO2 stored, gigatons of CO2, from 2020 out to 2090. The original dots and vertical lines are IPCCs, but to try to reduce the opacity of IPCC reports, I've drawn lines connecting the pathways of total sequestration in the IPCC scenarios. P1, as I said, which actually shrinks global energy demand very aggressively, does not require the use of CCS, but just relies on land use, agriculture, forestry to remove some CO2 from the atmosphere. true. But in my mind, the more realistic scenarios, P3, P4, as well as P2, which also is very aggressive on total primary energy demand, require us to build and scale up the industry of capturing and sequestering CO2 across the power sector, across industrial applications, and then ultimately through carbon dioxide removal, through bioenergy with CCS, or direct air capture and storage. So this is the range of what the IPCC thinks we need to do on CCS. I also really want to highlight what they say about the industrial sector. They see a major role in decarbonizing the industrial sector. And they emphasize that given the long lead times to scale up this industry, to do the innovation that Jeff and Bob talked about, that we need early scale up to achieve that 1.5 or even the 2 degree target. Finally, I want to turn away from the IPCC report, which looks at things from a global level, and highlight some of the recent modeling on the US and what needs to happen in the power sector. There are 4 reports that came out in roughly the 2016 range. We have the Obama administration's mid-century strategy report. We had the report I led for risky business called From Risk to Return. We had NRDC releasing its report on America's clean energy frontier. And we had the Union of Concerned Scientists releasing its power sector in a net zero world. All of these 4 studies, some of them looked at the entire economy, like MCS. Some of them looked at the entire energy sector, NRDC and risky business. And the UCS report looked at the power sector only. But each of them modeled the power sector and looked at very deep reductions in power sector emissions. There are some commonalities in their conclusions, despite the fact that they use different modeling platforms and different sponsoring organizations. Because of the dramatic drops in the cost of solar and wind, all of these 4 studies foresaw a 2050 power mix for the US that could be 50, 60, 75% or greater renewable, but complemented by fossil fuel with CCS, biomass with CCS, and or a continuing role for nuclear power. That's important. And this represents, in my mind, this represents the overwhelming consensus of mainstream energy and climate modelers who say we can decarbonize the power sector aggressively over the next 30 years, but a 100% renewable scenario is very difficult to achieve. But we can go high renewables with complementing it with some baseload nuclear and with some baseload and dispatchable CCS. And just to give one illustration of those 4 studies, this is the chart from the Union of Concerned Scientists study that modeled a 90% reduction in power emissions. They looked at here we are actual in roughly 2015. They projected a reference case of growth. This is terawatt hours total generation. Union of Concerned Scientists projected an electrification of the economy, as Bob was describing. So actually, total power production would grow as we electrify the economy. They looked at 4 scenarios. They looked at a very optimistic wind and solar case, optimistic CCS cost case, optimistic nuclear case, kind of a mid-range. And wind and solar became the dominant power source, but not the complete power source. In the UCS modeling, it was complemented by our existing hydro base in the blue. There was still a role for nuclear in orange. A big role for natural gas was CCS, complementing the variable output of solar and wind, and then some gas turbines uncontrolled. This is very important to realize that in mainstream energy and climate modeling, there is a very important role for CCS in the power sector. There's also an important role for CCS in the industrial sector, and ultimately, as we probably overshoot safe atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, there's going to be a very important role for CCS in carbon dioxide removal. So I will stop there and go on to our next speaker. Thank you.
Samantha McCullough of the International Energy Agency is going to speak to us today as well. She's head of the CCS unit in Paris, and her team provides leading analysis and insights on the development and deployment of carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies. She is a lead author of recent IEA publications, including one of the more recent 2017 Energy Technology Perspectives. Prior to the IEA, she spent several years in the Australian government working on the policy director of the Australian Coal Association, and then also in the Australian government working on coal policy and energy market reform. So she's going to discuss the role of carbon capture in all of the above energy portfolio for us today. So thank you, Samantha.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation to be here. I will try to go as fast as possible. I realize we're quite behind time now. But at the IEA, we have a comprehensive and quite an all-inclusive approach to fuels and technologies, and this includes a dedicated team working on CCS. Our membership covers around 75% of global energy demand, and this gives us a unique perspective to analyse current trends as well as long-term energy pathways. And just this week, we released an update of our global energy and CO2 status report, and I'd like to share a few highlights from this because I think it's quite relevant and an important context for CCS development and deployment, and perhaps somewhat of a reality check as well. So 2018 was an exceptionally dynamic year for energy. Demand accelerated at twice the average growth rate since 2010. It was at 2.3%. This was propelled by two key factors. The first one was the global economy that grew at 3.7%, which was faster than we've seen since 2010. The second key factor was weather conditions, which were responsible for around a fifth of the increase in global energy demand. So average winter and summer temperatures in some regions approached or exceeded historical highs or historical records. The cold snaps drove demand for heating, and more significantly, hotter summer temperatures pushed up demand for cooling. Almost 70% of this increased energy demand was met by fossil fuels. Gas leads the way at around 45%, but coal and oil accounted for a further quarter of the total growth. The power sector, so electricity, was responsible for around half of this growth, with electricity demand increasing by about 4%. And so although we saw double-digit growth in solar PV and wind, at this stage the acceleration of renewables deployment is actually not keeping pace with the growth in electricity demand. From a geographical perspective, China, the US and India together accounted for nearly 70% of the growth in energy demand. So globally, natural gas demand grew by an estimated 4.6%, which is the strongest increase we've seen again since 2010, when gas demand was rebounding from the 2008 financial crisis. China and the United States together accounted for around 70% of this growth. In particular, in the United States, natural gas consumption growth saw its highest increase since the early 1950s, at more than 10%. And the increase in the US market was actually equivalent to the entire gas demand in the United Kingdom. So it was very, very significant. Hence why we've called 2018 another golden year for gas. In terms of coal, global demand for coal again grew in 2018 by less than 1%, but it was the second year of growth in a row, although we're seeing much slower growth in coal compared to the 2000s. Coal is still the largest source of electricity globally and the second largest source of primary energy. And we're seeing three distinct trends. Here are the trends. In emerging Asia, outside of China, that is, coal demand is continuing to grow strongly. Here particularly we're looking at countries such as India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines and others. And the growth is mainly driven by the power sector and also for iron and steel production in India. So in many of these markets, coal continues to outcompete gas as an energy source. In advanced economies, the decline in coal continues, mainly pushed out by environmental factors, by cheap and abundant gas in some markets, and cheaper renewables. The trend in China is flattening. We've seen strong growth in coal demand for electricity generation, but this has been offset by a drop in residential and industrial use of coal, and that's primarily linked to concerns around air pollution. So the result is a growth in coal consumption of around 1% in 2018. So looking now at the impact of this on global CO2 emissions, uniquely during the period 2014 to 2016, we saw that the global economy continued to expand while CO2 emissions actually remained stagnant. This was the first time we've really seen this in decades. It was primarily driven, this stagnation of CO2 demand, emissions was primarily the result of a switch from coal to gas, particularly in China, but also in the US. But we saw in 2017 and 18 that the dynamic really changed. As I've mentioned, the increased global energy demand saw an increase in demand for fossil fuels, and this saw CO2 emissions grow by 1.7%. That's 560 million tonnes of additional CO2 emissions, which brought us to a historical high of 33 million tonnes, or billion tonnes of CO2 for the year. The increase just last year is equivalent to the emissions of all international aviation. The increase was the highest growth that we've seen since 2013, and it's 70% higher than the average emissions growth that we've seen since 2000. Also, for the first time in many years, we're seeing emissions from developed economies growing. However, the increase could have been much higher if not for increases in energy efficiency, renewables, coal to gas switching, and nuclear, which together avoided around 640 million tonnes of emissions. In the US, some of the recent gains in emissions reductions were reversed in 2018, where there was a 3.1% increase in emissions. This was largely in response to weather conditions, and I mentioned earlier the increase in energy demand associated with that. However, emissions in the US remain around the 1990 levels and 800 million tonnes below their peak in 2000. So this is the largest absolute decline that we've seen from any country anywhere in the world. So coal use still accounts for the largest share of CO2 emissions. That's across all uses. But particularly coal-fired power generation accounts for around 30% of the emissions. And in 2018, they were the single largest contributor to the growth in emissions, up by 280 million tonnes to exceed 10 billion tonnes annually for the first time in history. So the majority of coal-fired generation capacity is found in Asia, where, as Senator Manchin said this earlier, the average age of plants is only around 12 years, and that's compared to around 40 years in Europe and the US. This is one of the reasons, well, CCS is one of the few technology solutions we have to address these emissions that could otherwise be locked in effectively for decades to come. That's one of the reasons why the IEA has suggested that without CCS it really will be practically impossible to meet our climate targets. So very, very quickly, I just wanted to highlight that's the state of play at the moment in terms of some of the global trends. We see CCS playing a really important role in terms of getting where we need to go in terms of meeting longer-term climate goals. I just want to share with you some of our longer-term modelling from our energy technology perspectives. This shows the mix of technologies that are needed to get from where we're currently heading now, which is the reference technology scenario, to where we would need to go for a 2-degree pathway. A mix of technologies is needed, and CCS delivers around 14% of the emissions reductions needed in the period to 2060 across both power and industrial applications. However, as we increase climate ambition, so does the role of CCS increase. So we also did a further modelling exercise looking at trying to reach net negative emissions from the energy sector by 2060. And you see the role of CCS in achieving those additional emissions reductions increases to 32%. And this is primarily because in a 2-degree scenario, the power sector is already almost decarbonised. And so you need to start attacking the emissions in other sectors such as the industrial sector. Also, CCS plays an important role in terms of delivering negative emissions. So that achieving the sort of deployment that's envisaged in our scenarios really would require a very significant scale up from where we are today. The good news is that we're seeing a lot of momentum behind CCS at the moment, and a lot of that is really driven from the US's leadership, and particularly the 45Q tax credits. Our preliminary analysis of the 45Q tax credits suggests that we think global, that one measure alone could double the rate of CO2 capture globally. And of course, this is something that we and many others are watching with great interest to see what happens over the coming years with 45Q. But there are also positive developments that we're seeing elsewhere with more projects under development, and I think a growing commitment from governments and industry to CCS, and this recognition that CCS will be important to really bridge the gap between our longer term climate goals and the reality of today's energy system. So with that, thank you.
Thank you very much, Samantha. And I know that we are over our 1 o'clock end time, but for those of you that need to leave, please, we don't want to keep you here, but for those of you that can stay, I do hope that we can have a few questions for the speakers, which we were reserving for the end of this session. And so why don't I go ahead and just ask any of you that are still here if you have any questions that you wanted to raise with our speakers. Sure. I'm going to ask our speakers, and go ahead. Our speakers could maybe come stand up here, and then you can go ahead and answer the questions. But we have one question here. Go ahead.
Hi, Colin with the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. If you look at DOE's research and development portfolio, all of CCS is in gold on this. And I'm just curious, you talked about the need for CCS to address industrial sector emissions. What are the R&D needs to look at these other sectors to look at cement or steel or
Thanks for the question. I think it's always difficult when we're talking about CCS and industrial applications because there's not one industrial application, and in terms of the R&D needs, they would differ depending on the application. I like to remind people I'm talking to in different forums that there are low-cost opportunities for CCS. I think someone mentioned earlier, separating the CO2 from natural gas processing is an inherent part of the process. This is something that we're doing anyway. Capturing CO2 from maybe a bioethanol facility, where there's a relatively high purity CO2 stream. These are lower cost applications, and the IEA, actually, we did some analysis last year and identified that globally we think there's around 450 million tonnes of CO2 that could be captured for either use or storage if there was an incentive of less than $50 a tonne. So these are established processes. They've been used in industry. We know how to do EOR. Storage has been being undertaken in Norway for more than 20 years. So the R&D needs shouldn't stop the early commercialisation of CCS. There is a need for more pilot demonstrations in applications such as cement, steel, different applications of steel, and some of the other industrial applications. And we're seeing, particularly in Europe, the growing move towards establishing these pilot programs and pilot plants for CCS.
Can somebody, maybe Karl, just for those who don't know about negative emissions, can you talk about VACs and how do negative emissions?
The question is what are negative emissions or carbon dioxide removal? And just to set up the contrast, if you have an ordinary fossil fuel power plant or an industrial source and you put CCS control technology on it, you are reducing emissions. Maybe you're reducing them 90%, maybe you're reducing 100%, of those emissions, and of course that stops any addition to the problem of greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide removal is actually setting up a technology to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, or to have a net negative impact by removing. So if we grow plants and then burn them as a biomass power plant and inject the CO2 into the ground, we're effectively removing CO2 from the atmosphere, processing it through a power plant, and then injecting it. Similarly, the idea of direct air capture would be literally machines that would process immense quantities of air, extract the CO2 from the air, and then create a stream that could be injected underground. Right now that looks very energy intensive, but optimistically we might be able to bring the cost of that down to between $100 and $200 a ton. So those are two examples that involve CCS. There are also research being done through the that would enhance certain rocks doing chemical transformations and removing carbon dioxide from the air. But I'm not a chemist on that. Is Julio still here? You can maybe talk about that. Other questions? Okay, I have a question for you. How many watched the Super Bowl? Wow, not very many. No. Okay, how many thought it was a good game? Okay, how many remember the Budweiser commercial on corn syrup? Oh, okay. How many remember the Budweiser ad on wind power? Couple. Okay. Is anybody buying more Budweiser because they're going to go 100% wind? Okay, it didn't have a big impact. Nonetheless, it was an iconic moment. The use of Bob Dylan's "Blowing in the Wind," Clydesdales, taking the beer wagon past the windmills. So I would suggest, on a note of levity, as we wind up here, that maybe the Carbon Capture Coalition, part of its 5-year plan would be at some Super Bowl ad in the future. You got to find an iconic rock song to ruin. You got to have the Clydesdales, going kind of slow motion past that power.
Messaging is clear, something that we do need to do better, but we're trying to do that. Thank you, Karl. I just wanted to remind folks, if you haven't seen it already, we are going to do a little bit more of a deeper dive at our next briefing that will answer some of these questions that were already raised. So our next briefing is scheduled for April 26th, and we will be sending out another notice on that. But what we're going to be doing at that briefing is literally a carbon capture technology 101. So if you are one of those that likes to see flow diagrams or wants to know exactly how electricity is made and how you would put a carbon capture system in an electric power plant or some of these other industrial processes that we discussed, that's the time to come and hear from us and others about what we really mean by carbon capture. That one will be followed by another briefing in May that will look at all of the other storage opportunities for CO2, including utilization, CO2 conversion, direct air capture, and things like that. So we do intend to go into a much deeper dive. Hopefully today the preview was enough to inspire you to come to these other briefings. But we'll certainly be sending you a notice, and again, want to thank you all for your time. I know that we're way over, but really appreciate you all wanting to come and learn more about this. I want to thank not only our hosts, but the staff of our host organizations that helped us to put together this event, Lee and Mike and others that were very involved, and Brad's team too, to help us put together this briefing series, and also to all of our sponsors and to our speakers. So thank you very much. Hopefully you'll have an opportunity to talk with them a little bit before they leave. So thank you again.